Well, welcome to GovExperts Insights, where we talk about politics, policy, and the practice of both. On this episode, we're talking with R.J. Johnson, the president of the World Orphan Fund and a Wisconsin-based political and public affairs expert with nearly 40 years of experience. Welcome, R.J., to the program.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Now, R.J., you founded I wanted, before we get into talking about the World Orphan Fund, I want to talk a little bit about your public affairs career and how you got started, and nearly 40 years of experience seeing democracy in action, helping it work. Tell us a little bit about what drew you into public policy and political activities.
Well, thanks for mentioning 40 years 2 or 3 times. I appreciate that, Chris. I grew
It's
up
only an admiration, I will say that.
I grew up around politics. I was born in the District of Columbia. I was raised in Maryland, and so my daily staple was what was going on in Congress. I started college in Florida in the late 70s and was a Democrat. That's what my parents were. But saw this guy named Ronald Reagan and was just moved by that was me. And there were a lot of people like me that switched parties back in the early 80s. Ended up being chairman of the College Republicans, went to work for the Republican Party of Florida, worked for Jeannie Austin, who ended up being co-chair for Lee Atwater when Bush 1 was elected. She liked in-house talent, so she helped cultivate me. I was the youngest political director in the country in the mid 80s. Went to work for the RNC under Atwater in 88, did national voter registration, and then needed to find that job that was going to take me to the next level of my career. Somehow ended up in Wisconsin from Florida, which was a culture shock for me, but the values were the same. Became executive director here, ended up doing 2 stints with the RNC as Midwest Regional Political Director, and then became a political consultant here. Did Steve Forbes' presidential campaign, the second one around, and hooked up with a guy named Scott Walker very early on. Worked all 4 of his gubernatorial races as a political consultant. Ended up working in Act 10 here, which was, as many people watching this probably remember, was one of the biggest political meltdowns in the country, certainly in Wisconsin history, where we basically did away with public sector unions. And that's when I decided to start the World Orphan Fund, was the year that Scott Walker passed Act 10. So simultaneously was traveling to Central America and running the third-party effort here to fend off the unions who are trying to recall our legislators.
Yeah, those are some fascinating times. So you got to work for and witness Lee Atwater, which is kind of a legend within Republican circles and American circles. Things. What would you say is the biggest lesson you took away from your time with Atwater?
Didn't have a lot of personal time with Atwater, but just he was a political animal from the get-go, and just kind of brilliant on a common man level. His co-chairman actually was the bigger influence for me, which was Jeannie Austin, someone who, basically in the 80s, she led one of the biggest state parties in the country, and the donor community was basically like, "You're a woman, you can't be doing that." And she took that to heart and ended up raising more money than any party in the country, and took on a kid. At the time I was 24 years old, to grow in-house talent. And I think that Atwater was kind of that way as well, was sort of working with people early on in their careers and giving them opportunities to learn and grow. And those are the things that shaped me for the battles that were to come, 20 years later.
So fast forward, we move forward then to the battles there with Scott Walker and the public unions. I still remember the visuals of the state capitol and the protests there, but yet you persevered and pushed through. What kind of best prepared you for that battle and the resulting impact?
Well, Chris, it was interesting because when Act 10 was passed and the recalls began, I mean, I think you remember our Capitol was actually occupied by over 100,000 people. Government was shut down. The Democrats ran to Illinois so that we couldn't pass a bill. The aftermath of that was basically the Democrats and liberals got a head start on shaping the message. Our state became, basically even within families fighting over this particular issue. And it changed the whole political climate to the point where districts that were typically Republican were actually Democrat. We lost the PR fight in that early on. And so when we got into the battle for actually keeping our guys in when the unions came in and tried to recall us. They came in with $25 million. They brought in their entire DC shop and occupied an entire floor of a building in Madison. Walker, with our team, decided to stay local, and because we had pulled together before against, we had learned how to work together as a team. When I first started politics here, everybody had their own lane. The bankers did their thing, the realtors did their thing, the Chamber of Commerce did their thing, and they just kept getting beat in elections. And we were at a point where we decided that if we didn't work together, we were going to get rolled in every election. And so what prepared us was the ability to work together, not worry about whose label was on anything, not worry about what message might work best for the chamber, but what message might win. And so we ended up putting together an operation that was half of what the unions did. But we won because we understood that we had to get out of a left-right fight. If we were going to debate and fight on Act 10, we were going to lose. So we had to look at how do we shape these races in ways that transcend the left-right balance. And that's how we went after their candidates and basically won every recall in the state.
Yeah, that's incredibly interesting. I see some parallels to races here in Texas and elsewhere around the country that have followed that. But a fascinating time in Wisconsin politics. Looking back on it, how do you, from that time till now, things, what anything you would do differently?
Well, from a policy perspective, unfortunately, we had an opportunity to split the bill, where we didn't need a majority of folks here to pass it. And they held out for 3 months. And unfortunately, when you hold something like that, that's just so toxic, and you have a motivated group coming in and running advertising and telling people what this debate's all about, you give them an opportunity to shape that debate. That was our biggest mistake. I mean, honestly, we were fortunate to survive the messaging battle because they came in very quickly and framed what it was all about. I think our ability to know how to do things here in Wisconsin and how to fight on the kind of turf that we've been in for 20 years served us well against DC insiders that were trying to come in and basically run national campaigns. And I think your ability to sort of understand how to change how you fight is really important when you get into these sort of situations. And I think we're facing the same kind of thing in 2024. We did in 2022. You've got all kinds of issues that are changing the complexion of the electorate, whether it's the Dobbs decision or other types of things, the border that tend to completely shuffle the deck in terms of what issues are motivating voters. I think it's super critical to understand that and not try to fight the last campaign, but understand where people's heads are at currently.
Yeah, it's true. The politics of today are certainly scrambled on so many different issues. So, some of those districts, with the issues that have happened and been thrown, towards the public, I mean, you've got areas that, I mean, it's unknown how the electorate's going to react to it and everything. It's not a left-right battle anymore.
No, it's not. It's a completely different game. So I think that makes it more fun, but it also makes it way more complicated in terms of how to put together a winning coalition.
Very true. So let's transition now. So while the battle with the unions was ongoing, you were starting the World Orphan Fund and doing what got you interested in the World Orphan, the issue in general, and then led to the creation of the fund.
Well, I mean, it's I've thought hard about that. I was like, when was that moment? And it was a lot of moments, but I think what really sticks out in my mind was in the late 2000s, and around 2007, 2008, there were just story after story about the AIDS pandemic in Africa, and the number of kids who were made orphans. And I mean, in sub-Saharan Africa alone, there are like 16.9 AIDS/HIV orphans. And so I was looking at that going, this is just absolutely something that touches my heart. It's something that I need to try to be a part of helping. But honestly, I had no idea how to get involved. It took me 3 years from like 2007 to 2010 to figure out where it was. And it was all serendipitous at that. I'm a political consultant, so I would introduce myself to people as, hi, I'm a political consultant, but I really care about, and it truly became something I cared more about, is how do I help orphan children? And in the end, I met some 20-year-old kid at a youth mission camp in Meisenheimer, North Carolina, who invited me to an orphanage in Honduras in 2010. I, of course, said yes to a 20-year-old, and then called my wife and told her I was going to Honduras with a 20-year-old. And she's like, "Well, that sounds about like you." And so that's how it started. And it was the biggest orphanage in Honduras. And I realized at that point that there were just significant things that just we could do to have an impact. And honestly, our thought was we're going to start out with one or two small projects. Maybe we'll do, a well. Maybe we'll do a house for toddlers. And what it's turned into over the last 13 years is we've now been to 15 countries. We have visited 126 orphanages. We have traveled, north of 1 million miles. We're all volunteer, by the way. My organization is zero overhead. So we have no staff, we have no headquarters. We pay our own travel, we pay our own administrative costs. And so we took on the idea that we would use every dollar of what we raised to make a difference for orphans. What happened over that period of time of visiting all those orphanages is we started to become very well aware of what the consistent problems were. And I think that the political side of me really prepared me for the orphan side of the world, in the sense that I've never approached a campaign that I've been involved with or an issue with sort of a preconceived notion of this is what I need to say or this is how I need to deal with it. And that served me well because most of the things that we've gotten into, and we'll talk about some of them, have really been things that I never would have said, that's what we're going to be doing. It came out of basically a lot of time spent with people on the front lines for orphan children around the world and realizing that there's some pretty significant issues that we can have an impact on.
Y'all's projects involve like emergency food in Kenya, and then I think COVID staples in Guatemala. I mean, you've been very timely in regards to this, but give us a little bit of idea of what the activities are that you're doing. A well, staples, food, you name it. Is that kind of how do you organize?
Kind of focus on two major areas. One is sort of urgent and emergency relief, and that's served us. Most recently that's been Ukraine. When the war broke out there, we'd not been in Eastern Europe before, and we were able to build quickly relationships with people on the ground. It was complete chaos. The larger organizations, you couldn't even ask them where to help because they're like, we're not ready to talk to you yet. And because we're a small organization, we're nimble, we don't have red tape, and we're willing to get on the ground very quickly. We were able to find space where we've delivered, like 12,500 coats and boots and blankets, 37 generators. We're working with 5 centers that we fund in Romania for kids who have been evacuated from the east out of the war. So that's one of those situations where things just kind of blew up all at once. We felt the need and the ability to get in and do something, and since then it's become a major part of our work. In Kenya, it was a different situation. It was the perfect storm where you had the worst drought in Kenyan history, 5 consecutive years of not good rainfall on top of COVID, on top of sort of the economic shrinking that happened with COVID, which meant that donors were not putting money into small nonprofits, and all of a sudden you had a food crisis. So part of our operating style is to find partners on the ground. We have a partner there that we work with that we're able to sort of extend our reach because we are staff free to visit orphanages. And so we have actually provided food relief and staples to 48 orphanages in Kenya. We're actually going back there in September to visit a lot of those homes because we're starting to see things that we know that we can make a difference with. I started to get pictures back, of a lot of these kids, and the ones that you're probably going to show are the super pretty kids, and they are all beautiful. But I started to see a lot of them with dark teeth, and I talked to our partner, and I'm like, "What's going on there? How is the dental care situation?" And they're like, "There isn't one." And so we're probably going to start looking at some of those more basic things for Kenya that came out of, an emergency situation. So emergencies are kind of our bread and butter, and because we can move quickly, we often move money within 24 hours. We fly to everywhere that we get involved. Our board members are on the ground. We're at the orphanages. I've been to Ukraine 4 times since the war broke out because there's really no other way to understand situations and people without getting directly involved and seeing it for yourself. There are a lot of, particularly in Ukraine, but other places where there's a lot of corruption. And to try to sort of get through that and make sure that your donor resources are having the impact that you want, you got to see it firsthand to make a difference. So emergencies is one part of it. The other part of it, frankly, is the long-term things that we found. We could talk about that as you want. But two things in particular stick out to me. One is developmental delays for orphans. We found this especially true in Guatemala, but it's true everywhere due to malnutrition, neglect, abuse. We have kids that basically come in at age 3 that are 12 months behind in development. So we've created a childhood development center in San Lucas, Guatemala, that basically evaluates and provides therapies for kids who are developmentally delayed. We've worked with over 300 since 2016. And what's interesting about that, Chris, is if you find a child who's delayed, who's under 5 years old, you can really pretty much get them back to where they need to be. If it's after 5 years old, you start to find that you can't make certain changes. And so we found that early interventions is something that we're going to be spending a lot of time on as the World Orphan Fund. The other thing is aging out. And this is a problem here in the US with foster care kids, and it's a problem in Central America as well, in the sense that the statistics are absolutely grim in terms of the outcomes. In third world countries, you're talking maybe as high as 90% of the kids either get into drugs, prostitution, crime, gangs, simply to survive. So if you don't get involved early on in helping prepare them and work with them for the world outside, you're just going to have a repeat of the situation that created them in the first place. And we see the same thing here. And it's the same issues. It's exactly the same issues we see in that's created foster kids here is what's creating orphans in these other countries. The only difference is they don't have a foster care system. They have the old orphanage system, which is where we used to be.
You view kind of obviously your role in the emergencies, but just in child welfare in general, these countries, do you view it as a response to a family breakdown there, a government policy breakdown there, a combination thereof?
Both.
Yeah.
I mean, like let's just take Guatemala because I've spent in Honduras where I spent a lot of time. Most of those kids are not let's define orphan. Orphan is not the typical Dickens, view of a kid who's lost both parents in most cases. It's kids who have been pulled out of situations or abandoned because the parents were unable or were a dangerous place for those kids to be. So in Guatemala and Honduras, the court system pulls them out of a dangerous situation and puts them in an orphanage. What created that? More often than not, it was a breakdown of the family. It was a mom who got pregnant, was abandoned by the male. Another male comes into the situation, not happy with, or really care about the kids that came before. And so the dysfunction of not having a family and all the dynamics of poverty that go into the choices that are made to try to, as a single mom, survive in that situation just creates an exponential problem with those kids. I think that, you have to figure out what space you're going to work in, because if you look at this problem, you can drive yourself crazy in trying to think of all the dynamics of what do I need to solve in order to make a difference with this problem. But on a policy level, if we're really going to make a difference, the most important thing that we can do is try to figure out a way to stabilize families, try to figure out a way to reunify kids with the families that are their birth families. Because honestly, no matter how bad the situation was that they came out of, those kids always want to go back to their family, no matter how dysfunctional that might have been. And so there's programs that we've supported in Guatemala that are actually working with the mothers to give them skills so that they can have, a way to earn an income, usually there's an aggressive male or often there's an aggressive male in the family that needs to be removed, that could be sexually abusing that child, that could be physically abusing the mom, that could be bringing in, the types of things from the outside world that kids can't be exposed to. I think a lot of that is actually the same thing that we see in inner cities in this country.
Yeah, I can see some parallels there. So as somebody that comes from the political realm, do you find yourself working with the governments of these of foreign countries, or do you wind up working around the governments of these foreign countries? I mean, are they a partner or are they an obstacle for you?
Depends. What's interesting is, there's so many different things that get mixed into that. Um, More often than not, we work around the governments. But we found that over time, well, the government sees the value and what our groups are doing, and they began to partner with us. For example, in Guatemala and in Honduras, where we have the transition program, government agencies in those spaces are using the manuals and the techniques that we've come to use across the board in their systems. Not all the time, but we're basically the innovators. And part of the problem is, and it's the same problem here in the US, is the problem is so big, you don't have enough people to deal with it. So there just aren't the social workers to, sort of focus on those individual children. And that's where the NGOs kind of come in and step up. We're working with a group actually in Texas. They're called Embrace Texas. They're in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. They're working with Child Protective Services to basically partner up and start working with kids 3 and 4 years before they exit from foster care. Because the same problem was existing there, which is, the kids get to the end of foster care, they go in for like a 4-hour session and they get a data dump of everything they need to know. And then they have to work the world on the outside. Now, hopefully they've got a foster family that continues to work with them, but more often they don't. And so in kind of talking with the government agencies there, because they're very a lot of this is you have to be careful with the laws that protect children, right? But if you're able to build a partnership over time and build a trust with them, they've actually in Fort Worth allowed our people to come in and start talking and creating relationships with those kids 3 and 4 years before they exit. And I think that to do that and start working with them on soft skills and start working on them with how to deal with conflict and all those things that ultimately, if you don't prepare them for that, are going to turn out very badly in the outside world. Um, there is a possibility to work with government. In other cases, not at all. In Ukraine, the government is everything because all of the institutions are basically government-run orphanages. And so you have to work with them. What's interesting about that is, and I'm kind of all over the place, and I hope you can edit this. I'm sure that
No, it's good
where you want to
conversation.
go. But let's take Ukraine for a moment. You got 100,000 kids who, when the war started, who are in government-run orphanages. 50% of those kids are special needs. And so and it's one of the reasons why they haven't gotten into the EU. It's the kinds of things that the European community says, you got to fix this before we're going to allow you in terms of how you treat your children, right? So there's some skepticism to this, but I actually believe that they're committed to do it. In May of 2023, President Zelensky formed a committee or a new group, an extra governmental group. It has a really, really long name. It's basically the Family Coordination Center. It's ridiculous. They need an acronym. But they created this sort of outside of the political structure group that they handpicked the people that were involved with it to come up with a plan to deinstitutionalize Ukraine. So imagine thinking about doing that for, in favor of family-based care. Imagine trying to do that in the middle of a war. But the commitment is there. And maybe the political impetus was, look, A, we know we need to do this. And B, if we ever want to sort of be stable and get into the EU, which is part of the way that we're going to be safe after this war, we're going to have to start making some changes. Whatever the reason is, the people that we're working with are committed to coming up with an entire new way of moving their kids and migrating their kids, both the special needs kids and the kids who are in orphanages, into family-based care. And they are reaching out to all parts of the world to find where the best practices are, bringing them in together and trying to mold their own system. So, but they've, what's interesting about it is they've invited us to be part of it. And we're a nonprofit. In fact, a lot of the implementation that's going to be done on that in terms of support for the kids is going to be nonprofits. So the government will provide maybe a certain number of social care, people, social workers, but the NGOs can bring in psychologists. They can come in and actually, buy a home for a foster family of 10. They're allowing for NGOs to come in. It's going to be very difficult, to manage this, as you might imagine. But it's one of those things where it's like, oh my gosh, if you ever had a magic wand and you decided, well, we're just going to work, and completely try to change something and drop all of our governmental, we own all of this, there's an opportunity there. So I think that it's possible to work with government agencies to make change, but they tend to be very jealous. They're also, like in Honduras, they're unionized. And when you start talking about deinstitutionalization, you start to get political pushback because there's actually a financial incentive for those people to have those children's homes. It's a really sick problem, but you can understand, how that is in a place where those are where the good paying jobs are. And so, yeah, it's been kind of a mix, but our transition program, our development program in terms of early interventions, actually, the social service agency in Guatemala is working with our Walker Center for Childhood Development to work with families who are adopting kids because they don't have enough social workers to work with those families. And what's happening is the family takes a kid out of an orphanage who's bringing all the baggage and oftentimes the emotional issues that they suffered from trauma into a family. And then the family who's got no preparation to deal with this and no support from any outside agency ends up throwing up their hands and going, whoa, we just can't handle this. This is blowing up. And the kid goes back to the orphanage, which is like the worst possible outcome. So the government asked us, will you work with our adoptive families to help them work through with these children? So we've been working with children that are being adopted before they're adopted. We work with the families and prepare them for what they're about to face. And we work with them for a year afterwards as a private NGO with the blessing of social services in Guatemala. So there's really opportunities to have those kind of impacts. But I would argue if you try to do that in the United States, it would be almost impossible. It's just the kinds of barriers and rules that you have to get in can be so overwhelming that they just don't welcome in sort of outside opportunities. Dallas is an exception to that.
Well, it's interesting too because as you talked about Ukraine and just and the example, and then on our own in the United States, how you go about changing these institutions that have evolved over time, it's incredibly difficult. And then you do get the institutional pushback. You get that is sometimes ingrained in rules and regulations and the law itself. And you get a frustration about how you can make a system responsive to the needs that it was originally set up for. Things we've got children that are having to stay overnight in child welfare workers' offices and
Yeah.
hotels here. So that it's been a big focus, but it's been a focus for many years with good people that are trying to solve that problem, yet it has not been solved yet.
Well, I mean, I am hopeful in the sense that that's exactly why there's two things that we invested in Embrace Waiting Children in Dallas. Number one was they wanted a pilot program because Child Protective Services was going to allow them to be engaged with these kids over a longer period of time. They're like, hallelujah, we got to do this. Number two is we help them purchase an actual location for a shelter that works with Child Protective Services so that when you've got a kid who's kind of not placed, you don't have to put them in an office or a hotel or ship them to someplace else because there's just no place to have them. Can you get that to scale? I don't know. But it's always been sort of like work in the space where you can make a difference. So if we can, make a difference in Dallas, Fort Worth and find something that works and others embrace that, and then there's an opportunity to maybe scale that, that's the best you can do. You can get so far into your head that you can't solve the entire problem that you don't do anything. And that's just unacceptable.
You're focused on the things that you can be the most successful at and will have the biggest impact that then maybe, as a case study and somebody else can, and you can support it going to scale when the
Exactly.
system things. Is that a
Exactly.
fair statement?
Exactly. I mean, and look, the desire is out there to get the information, I mean, and just by, the trauma informed care, which is just under misunderstood in most parts of the world. How to deal with a traumatized kid is not the same way in terms of discipline and all the issues that come along with that as you would normally expect is how you raise your children. It's just a whole different paradigm. To be able to train caregivers in government how to deal with kids like that with private enterprise, to be able to have more success in terms of how they work around that is going to make such a huge can make such a huge difference. So I think I'm just reinforcing what you've said, which is the innovations can come from the outside, and most oftentimes they have to, because institutions don't necessarily reform themselves. But what I've found is that most people who are on the front lines actually want it to get better. They're just kind of constrained by lack of resources, lack of people, and a system that just takes forever to change in a way that's going to make a significant difference. So I honestly believe, and it's probably from my conservative upbringing, that, and it's not sort of private enterprise entrepreneurial, it's people that don't have the kind of restrictions on them that can actually think outside of the problem. And I mean, the World Orphan Fund, I think if I had to say what's the best thing we've ever done, we've come in as outsiders without prejudice. So we don't come in with a white savior complex and say, here are the three things that you need to do. Here are the things that we can offer for you. It's a long conversation about what are the problems that you're facing. And what we found, like, with one orphanage, the first time I went there in 2012, it's one of the best orphanages in the country if you have to have a big orphan, or in the world if you have to have a big orphanage. They had this long list of stuff that they wanted for the orphanage. And I got into a conversation with them about their needs. And the biggest problem they had wasn't on their list. And I'm like, well, why don't you have this here? And what it was they are one of the few orphanages in Honduras that has a no turnaway policy for special needs kids. But they were getting to the point where they were running out of space. And the kids that they accepted were growing up and becoming more complicated, and they couldn't keep them within the general population. So if we didn't create a way for them to have more space for those kids, they were going to start turning away kids that basically had no other options. Um, I never would have known that
Yeah.
if we hadn't had a conversation with them about what their problems were. Same orphanage tells us that they have a frequent problem with fresh water and they can't afford their energy bills. And we're like, okay, so they try to drill wells. They don't work out super well. They don't get enough, output in terms of gallons per minute to make a significant difference. But they happen to mention that they're backed up against a mountain and they have a dam. And that dam is the source of a lot of their fresh water because in the rainy season, they hold the water and it's high and then they drop it through a filtration system, but they don't have enough of it. And I was talking with the director's father, who's German, and he's kind of an engineer type. And he said, if we raise that dam by 6 feet, we can extend the water supply by like 8 weeks. And I'm like, cool. Do you have a plan? No. Can you get a plan? Like, yeah. So they come in and we find out that for $18,000, which is the cost of drilling a well, that's not going to solve their problem, we're able to raise their dam by 6 feet, which completely changes the dynamic of fresh water at the orphanage. And then the other problem we found an energy expert in the United States to go, okay, how do we lower their power usage? And he went in and he put these little things on all their circuit breakers. And so he's like, where's all the power getting used? And find out the biggest use of power was moving water. So, okay, well, if it's moving water, then how do we use less water? And so literally on containers shipped in 250 low flush toilets. Can you imagine? This is a big orphanage. We put in little shower heads that injected air. We were able to cut their water use by 50%, which at the same time cut their power use by close to 50%. So it's like again, it's that sort of, we have a problem. We're so busy just trying to get through the day, trying to raise the money that we need. And I think it's the same thing in government agencies.
Yeah.
They're just trying to get through the problems of today, that they don't have that capacity to sort of get outside of themselves and think, blue sky a little bit. What could we do? And I think that's where nonprofits have a huge impact on both government groups and private orphanages, is to be able to be that outsider and just listen to them and hear what their problems are. They probably know the solution. They just haven't had time to think about it, and they haven't had a partner that goes, okay, let's do it.
When so many organizations, people are focused on, and this is true in the private sector as well, on the day to day. They don't have time to think innovatively. They don't have time to think, risk. They don't have time to think that much about the future because they're focused on whatever widget it is that needs to be done, whatever process or task that needs to be done.
Yeah,
And, there's no time allotted in the schedule for innovation.
correct. Correct.
So you've had such an interesting career in history. What's it like being a conservative political operative now working in child welfare policy globally?
Well, for one thing, it is no surprise. I think most of us in the political world get into this because we want to make things better. And I mean, there's a lot of citizens. There's some people out there that just, they have other motivations. But I think that's sort of what gets the most attention. What I have found is that conservatives are enthusiastically wanting to make a difference in the lives of children, either here or abroad. The people that I work with as political consultants all want to find a way to make a difference because that's what their DNA is. They're problem solvers, and they are actually big-hearted people. They want to make people's lives better. And when they kind of dig it, because it's like, in the political world, you can only have so much impact, and you try to get some congressman elected, and then he's got to climb his way up the leadership ladder, and so it's like, wow, this is going to take forever to get this small incremental piece, right? But I can jump into the nonprofit world and I can move at the speed of light and actually change people's lives. And when you show them how their money can do that, if they donate, or physically how they can do that, or how their expertise can be helpful. Interesting story. I met this little girl named Lapita in Honduras. She was 3 years old when she came in, HIV positive, um, and just kind of fell in love with her and kept track of her. And 2 years later, she's 5, talking to the orphanage director, and they're like, yeah, Lupita's not doing super well in school. And, we think she might be kind of special needs. And so we're kind of going down that track. And I'm like, well, have you ever had her like neurologically evaluated? And they're like, no. And I said, well, pay for it, do it. So they take her in, and they happen to mention to the doctors that Lupita's falling down all the time. And I'm like, oh, there's something more going on here. So they do an MRI. And then I get a text from the orphanage director and says, well, she's got a mass on her brain. And I'm like, oh my gosh. And like, it's a lesion. I'm like, whoa, well, what's causing that? Well, there's this thing called toxoplasmosis. And if you ever remember, like when you had your kids and you told your wife, if you had cats, don't let them get near the litter box. That parasite comes from that kind of source, right? So, but it gets inside. And now here's this kid with an incurable disease, HIV, who now has this parasite. Well, it's addressable, right? So they get her on medication, right? She starts having seizures because of the medication. It's a complicated problem. They're like, okay, what can we do to help you? We don't have the experts. Okay. So I texted Mark Green, who at that time was USAID administrator under President Trump. He was former congressman, former ambassador to Tanzania, all around great guy. Texted him on a Friday. Saturday morning, he gets back to me. I said, I need experts. He goes, my staff will be in touch with you on Monday. On Monday, I get a call and they said, we've already talked to NIH, National Institutes of Health. They are so excited because they don't get to do any of this kind of stuff, man. They're writing manuals. So they're like, we get to help a kid. We're all in. The guy who wrote the manual at NIH got connected with doctors for this little kid in Honduras and was able to solve that problem for that kid. And what we found out was, is the dumbest thing. She needed, she wasn't doing red blood cells. And she needed, a very basic supplement that is available at CVS here for like $1 for 30 that they didn't have there. And so we actually got on with Amazon, talked to some missionaries here and said, hey, we got to get a bunch of pills to Honduras. Amazon drops it to a guy in Pennsylvania. A guy in Pennsylvania flies it to San Pedro Sula. Missionaries in San Pedro Sula put it on a bus. Our kid in transition program gets on a motorcycle, drives it out to the orphanage, and 3 days later, they have what they need. The joy in being able to make a difference in a kid's life that way is so overwhelming. And to be able to tell that to people who are by nature wanting to make the world a better place. That's why they support politicians. That's why they get into policy positions. I honestly think that's what motivates us. To give them an opportunity to be part of that, they totally embrace it. One of the questions that you sent in advance was, how do you get along with the left-right thing?
Yeah, I was just about to go there.
And it's interesting because, I was kind of like, I was good at what I did in Wisconsin, which made me very hateable by the other side. Because you do what you have to do to win. And so you kind of get this like, okay, we don't work together. But what I found over time, like one of our biggest cheerleaders is the former Democratic Party chairman here, who helps us connect with the Milwaukee Bucks because he likes what we're doing. And sometimes you run into things, and I told Shonda Weary about this. When we were in Ukraine in January, we met with CORE. Have you ever heard of them? Sean Penn's group, CORE, Community Oriented Relief. Sean Penn is like just the most outrageously liberal person on the planet. And so if you looked at the politics of it, and of course they Google us and they can see, one of my board members does advance for Donald Trump. How are these two groups going to end up working together? And what we found was that the people on the ground didn't really care. And we didn't really care. All we cared about was how are we going to solve this problem. They're like, we got a bunch of wells that we need to be drilling on the front and, Mykolaiv. And, for about 20 grand a pop, we can change this community and this community and this community. And we're like, okay, so we'll work together on that. I think that it can be really hard because everything's so polarized, and any sort of indication that you have helped the other side, tends to get you shunned. I think that's the belief. But what I found is, okay, fine. That's some people. But most people, if you gave them a way to do something and work together, left or right, and they think they can make a difference in kids' lives, they'll do it.
Yeah. And I would think that that experience would be healthy going forward for other right-left discussions, and just realizing that there is a sense of one community out there that we all need to be focused on. But
yeah, and I think it's difficult. I'm looking at this debate on PEPFAR. You're familiar with that, right? It's basically the U.S. Will probably never get the credit it deserves, and that's kind of okay. We don't always get the credit, but we do amazing things for populations around the world. The PEPFAR program that was started under President Bush to get antiretrovirals to Africa has basically put the stop to an absolute pandemic that was killing millions of people. And you see this sort of left-right debate about foreign aid and whether or not, well, should we be doing that? And we have our own problems here. I think that if you were to step back and realize the difference that it makes in the long run, that you took an interest in the lives of people in other countries, and there's always limits in how you do that, but there is an amazing ability for us that's good for us as humans, but also good for us as a country to make friends and make a difference. If you're saving a kid's life in another country, you've got a friend for life in that government.
yeah,
And it starts to play out. And again, there's limits to what you can do with that. But I think that it's really frustrating when it gets into a this or that kind of left-right debate, because I don't really see it that way. I think that they're both problems. I think we've got a problem at the border, and I think we can do amazing things, frankly, for very little cost, like the PEPFAR program, that have built relationships for us with countries across Africa. And if you've ever been to Africa, the first thing you realize is the Chinese are all over that continent. They are buying their way in with airports and roads and cell phones and towers and all that stuff. You've got sort of this battle for where, I mean, think about what kind of minerals and things that are important to this country that come out of that continent. The other thing that you have going is just a sort of wildfire of Islamic radicalism that you see with groups like Boko Haram that are abducting kids, and so you've got this sort of all this pressure that's going on in a country, a continent that that you can have an impact on that impact us here in the United States in the long run. That probably will get me kicked out of certain meetings, but I honestly believe that if you bury yourself in the sand on that and you ignore the existential fight that's going on worldwide, there will be a consequence for the next generation of people in this country. And so I like I said, I don't post political things on my Facebook page because it brings people's ire. But really frustrating. And I wish that people could, you know, Ukraine is an example. I don't even understand why we're having this fight over whether it's the border or Ukraine. The first time I went to Ukraine and I started meeting these people, I'm like, God, these people are just like us. They think like us. They laugh at the same jokes. They have the same desires to make their families better and the kids. I mean, it is an early democracy in a place that was producing what percent of the world's, grain. There's just so many things there that were alike, and to not allow sort of um, the next step of conquest to go on. I'm getting really political here, and that's not what the World Orphan Fund is
No, but
about.
Ukraine is the American Midwest, basically.
Yeah,
In terms of economy, production, breadbasket, and to the world. And you talk about the choices that we have to make, Ukraine to the border. I think so much of today's politics is, people try to drive it down to a binary choice, either A
exactly.
or B. And the world is a lot more complicated than that. And you can't look out and see what China is doing, what Russia is doing, what radical Islamists are doing, things, and not recognize that we are facing threats in a way that we have not faced before. And we have got to figure out strategies that combat that, minimize that, if we're to secure our place in the world for the
Exactly.
long term, because we can't take that for granted.
It's a historic shift. And sort of back to the nonprofit side of thing, the things that you do in terms of helping people in those countries pay big dividends, not only, on the sort of political side of it, but just on the humanitarian side of it. So you really do benefit both ways. It is not just a handout. I mean, and also, if you're looking at border issues as an example if you've been to Honduras and Guatemala, you can completely understand why those people want to get their kids the hell out. Honduras is one of the most violent places on the planet. They will shoot you in the face for a cell phone. The gangs own the place. So
When you're seeing like the things that are going on along our southwest border and the countries that those migrants are coming from, things you understand what they're fleeing.
oh, totally. And I also believe that if you're smart, the only way to stem that flow, they're just going to keep coming. I mean, that's human nature. You're going to try to survive. You're going to try to give your children an opportunity in the world. And if you think that's just impossible, you will do anything to get to the other side. So if you know that's the problem, what can you do to make a difference in terms of making it better for them to survive and be able to build the kind of communities that used to be there before the drug cartels basically invaded Honduras and took over a lot of what's going on governmentally. I just think that you can be smart on the border and go, we can't just have unlimited people coming in, but you also at the same time can be smart about what's the cause and how can we make a difference in terms of, and how does that benefit us? I mean, you raise the quality and standard of living in Central American countries and you give them the capacity to spend money, they're going to buy our stuff. So it's not,
Right.
you not only just solve the problem, you create, sort of people that you can sell stuff to. So I don't know, my worldview as I've gotten older, I guess, has just become a lot more complicated than the politics of today allows for discussions.
It's a fascinating session. Yeah, I wish I I'd made bigger decisions in my life when I was 16 and knew everything, because from that point forward, I just remember how much I don't know and things. And that seems to be every day. But this has been a fascinating discussion. You're doing some wonderful things with the World Orphan Fund. I want to kind of segue out here with, what advice would you give kind of to the 40, to the young person starting off in a career in public policy and politics? What advice would you give them? And feel free to speak to kind of how a nonprofit and some of these bigger causes and everything could be in their future too as charity work.
I think you take that first step. Honestly, it's amazing when you talk to people how many, particularly younger people. I think this next generation is so different. It almost reminds me of the 60s generation, but with a different slant, in the sense that they really do want to make a difference in the world, and they're making choices. Even, conservative, left, right, doesn't matter. They feel a call in a way to try to make a difference. And I guess what I would say is it starts with the first step. I didn't know where I was going to go. Find where your passion is. Find a group that you can connect with. It's probably not going to be the place that you end up, but it's that first step that gets you to the next step, that gets you to the next step, where you start to find places where you can make a difference. And I would say get outside of your comfort zone. Get outside of the government place that you're in. Get outside of the United States if you can, because it's going to start to shape you in a very different way. It's a blessing and an opportunity to be able to be exposed to these other things, because it just makes you better able to understand a situation here at home. But I'd say find a group, get involved. I have a line of people who are political consultants and operatives who want to go to different countries with us. They want to be a part of this. And I think that's true of lots of nonprofits. I think it's true here in the US, and I think it's true of international nonprofits like us. So take that first step.
Thank you very much. That's great, great counsel, great insight. And we appreciate you spending some time with us, chatting about the World Orphanage Fund and your career. And we look forward to staying in touch. And, our guest today has been RJ Johnson with the World Orphanage Fund. And thank you all for tuning in to GovExperts Insights.
Thanks for joining this edition of GovExperts Insights. We invite you to follow this and other episodes at govexperts.com or on LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, and our other social media channels.